Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the warm-up packet cycle that has us looking at the first half of that cycle. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to write down the questions and the answers that correspond with the warm-ups, and please remember to format your answers in a different colored font. Please also remember to not submit just yet, as you will need next week's warm-ups accordingly. Let's go ahead and get started. For Monday and Tuesday's lesson, what specific events led Japan to go from an isolationist country to an imperialist powerhouse country by the World War II era? Let's go ahead to the answer. Outside influences. Japan sought to rid itself from the Western ways of life and influence. Christianity, capitalism, and other cultural phenomena were not necessarily taken so lightly by the imperial rulership for the time. Additionally, many people in Japan felt the threat of the Western ways of life. Industrialization. Japan developed several key industrial innovations which transformed its economy forever. Many different types of steam engines and, of course, transportation mechanisms were really important for transforming Japan, and they often got these things from the Dutch. Increased pressures. The United States and other Western countries demanded access and entry into Japan. Of course, with success and failures, different countries found different spheres of influence in Japan. Rulership. The Meiji Emperor and government for the time sought to modernize Japan, especially once opening up its doors to outside influences. Of course, they advanced government and industry and infrastructure. Militarization too took place. This is where the Japanese government built up military immensely and stoked nationalist fervor amongst the population. And finally, takeover. Japan began to systematically take over parts of China, Greater Asia, and the Pacific. This, of course, would lead us into the World War II era. For the next question of the day, let's go to Thursday and Friday. What specific characteristics or events define and describe Japan during World War II? Let's go ahead to the answer to the question of the day. Dominant. Japan took over many places in Asia and the Pacific over a series of 10 years. And with relative success, they established their spheres of influence all across Asia and the Pacific. Aggressive. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in the Pacific and thus declares war on the United States. In retaliation, the United States would later declare war on Japan. Defensive. The Japanese were forced to defend their territorial holdings in the Pacific and in Greater Asia as Allied forces waged war with relative success. Decimated. The Japanese fought to the bitter end, with kamikaze pilots crashing their planes systematically into US and Allied battleships, and of course they led an all-out national effort to defeat the Allied powers. Of course they would later lose with the 2 atomic bomb droppings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus ending their chances for victory. Surrender. The Japanese would later surrender when they realized that the mainland invasion was imminent, and their manpower and resources were limited too. As the war waged on, it became very clear even to the Japanese that their chances of winning were over. And occupation. During this era after World War II, the United States ruled Japan actively to remake the country essentially in its image, thus imposing a new style of government, a constitution, and additionally a new way of lawmaking and a new way of life. Ironically enough, the Japanese and Americans would have a solid relationship after World War II. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the warm-ups and the rest of the lessons.